It's time for Talking Pictures Trivia. A quick friendly reminder, if it's trash night, take out the trash.
Welcome to Talking Pictures Trivia, the podcast in which a group of geographically challenged friends explore movies through trivia as an excuse to keep their friendships alive. I'm one of these friends and today's host, Nick, and with me is...
Tom.
And KJ.
Great to have you back as always. Additionally, joining us as a guest for this episode is...
Doug.
Great to have you, Doug. Doug is a longtime friend of ours going back to elementary school. You may remember Doug from our first episode, Raiders of the Lost Ark, as well as Solaris. It's great to have Doug back to kick off another season. After triple checking, we verified that Doug still conveniently likes movies. For those joining us for the first time, we start off each episode with a movie quiz, as these pivotal questions will determine who earns today's trivia crown. Then, once the fierce competition is over, we followed up with our famous movie rant where anything goes. KJ, tell us about today's movie.
This week, we'll be heading back to 1973. A ceasefire has been called for the Vietnam War. Elvis is holding a concert in Hawaii, and the World Trade Center officially opens in New York City. In the middle of all this, George Lucas releases his second movie, American Graffiti. George Lucas, of course, also known for THX 1138, Star Wars, Star Wars, Star Wars, and Star Wars. American Graffiti shared theaters with Enter the Dragon, Westworld, Mean Streets, and Jesus Christ Superstar. Nick's going to be quizzing us today. Nick, how would you describe American Graffiti?
Before I go into that, the theme for our first 3 episodes this season are movies that the quizzer has meant to watch for quite some time but hasn't got around to it yet. Being a Star Wars fan, I've always wanted to watch George Lucas's first hit movie, American Graffiti. All I knew is this movie did not take place a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. We're introduced to a group of teenagers during their last day of summer vacation in 1962. We follow these characters as they branch out on a series of mishaps and escapades over a single night, literally until the sun comes up. Lessons are learned by all, well, some, and we're awkwardly informed about some of their futures in the end. Tom, if you had only one word to describe American Graffiti, what would it be?
Chrome. How about you, KJ?
My word would be nostalgia. How about you, Doug?
Bitchin'.
Nice. And my word would be vignettes.
It's time for Movie Quiz.
For this week in Movie Quiz, we will be having 4 questions. Each question will be worth 1 point, and there's a chance there may be a bonus tiebreaker. We shall see.
It's time for Question 1.
What is the license plate number on John Milner's Boss Ride?
Locked in.
Locked in.
Locked in.
Okay. KJ, you were last. Start it up.
I don't know. I didn't see it. But if I was George Lucas and this was my second movie and I was going to put a license plate that was going to come up in a trivia podcast, it would be THX 1138.
Doug.
I believe it was close to that. I think it's THX 138.
Tom.
I think it was THX 138. The reason why I say that is just before coming on, I listened to a podcast about American Graffiti and learned that California license plates only had 6 digits at that time.
And the points go to Tom and Doug. KJ, very, very close. They are correct. There were only 6 digits, so it was THX 138. And as Tom started to bring up here, or actually all of you did, KJ, I think you started too, George Lucas's first film, and in fact, the first one was a short in college called Electronic Labyrinth THX 1138 4EB, which interestingly enough, we'll be covering early in this season in a shorts episode. I have not seen that. The other one was his first movie was the feature THX 1138, which is what I had seen, and I thought I had seen when we were talking about the short, but it turns out it was the full one. So we'll see how that short goes. And the interesting thing I wanted to bring up about this movie, just a little bit of trivia note here. This movie was a challenge by Francis Ford Coppola to George Lucas because his first movie was pretty much a flop. I mean, it really didn't get much acclaim. And he challenged him and said, can you just make a more mainstream movie? And Lucas pretty much said, you want mainstream? Fine. I'll make you a mainstream movie. And he made this one. It had a $77,000 budget. It pulled in over 115 million in US box alone, making it one of the most profitable movies of all time. The reason I wanted to bring up this question, in addition to just talking about John Miller's Boss Ride, was how this movie really played on nostalgia. This is what Lucas really focused on a lot. What were your guys' thoughts on the approach of using nostalgia in this movie?
I found it a little confusing, and we do notes in our preparation for this, and I hesitant to talk about this in any more detail because I imagine it might interfere with the question. But there's a particular way this movie ends. This movie is sort of, people coming of age, right? It's a coming of age story, and it's looking back when we were young, and and that type of thing. And it sort of captures the aimlessness of being young, and it also captures at the same time the long 1950s, right? The 50s that sort of end in November of 1963. And yet when you get to the end of the picture, and this idea of kind of loss of innocence, I don't exactly know what I'm supposed to feel about this period of nostalgia. Is it, or about Lucas's feelings towards this era? I mean, it seems nostalgic on one sense. He seems to love the kind of pre-British invasion rock and roll. He loves the cars back then. He loves driving culture. But at the same time, the movie ends with this kind of note of almost hostility, and it really reframes the film you just watched in a way that I found a little
Well,
confusing.
is this George Lucas's nostalgia? How old would he have been at this point? Was the nostalgia off because he was not
He graduated Modesto High School, I think, in
okay?
62.
So it does line up.
Yeah, so
Okay.
this was directly related to yeah. This is like if you grew up and went back into, for us, the 80s, right?
Actually, for us, it'd be the 90s, right? Because that's when we would have been driving around and cruising. Yeah.
Yes, you're right.
But I
90s.
wonder if that end note represents, like you're saying, Tom, the end of that 50s. So he's also saying, yep, it was this night. That was it. And then the world fell apart and everything was.
Yeah, everything, like, this was the golden age, and after this, everything went to pieces. Yeah, I mean, sure, that's fine. I suppose I could get on board with that reading, but it seems I don't know, kind of somewhat disappointing.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I can really relate to that era, not having lived through it. It's a few generations or a few decades before, but yeah, I'm not quite sure what to make of it either.
I will say what I liked about it. I do like how he gets at the sort of aimlessness of being a young man. And this is a man's movie, right? The female characters in this movie are plot points. They're not particularly,
It's true.
yeah, they're not particularly developed. It's about these four lead characters, and it's kind of a problem in the movie. I think that they sort of don't have a lot of regard for the female characters other than plot mechanisms. But anyway, it's about these four main characters and the sort of aimlessness of being young. And I think that was probably the most interesting thing about the movie. But he, in his depiction of the 1950s, and I know it's 1962, but like the 50s were like up till the death of Kennedy, really. He's selecting music that ranges from about 1954 to the Beach Boys, which is 1962, the song they listen to, that John is listening to when he's like, I hate this crap. Rock died with
Surfer
Buddy.
Boys.
Yeah, Rock died with Buddy Holly. And so it's not necessarily a depiction of Lucas's 1962, his coming of age. It's a depiction of an era that is longer than the thing that Lucas experienced. It's not just about this moment of transition, which is kind of lame, right? It's like, oh, you have to go to college and move on, or you have to stay with your girlfriend and realize the recognitions the characters have are kind of boring, I think. What's more interesting is the fact that he is highlighting an entire era, right? And the entirety of the 50s using the soundtrack.
And going back to my point about Coppola's challenge, I think he was extremely successful because, just like Doug said, we are not from that generation, so we can't relate to the nostalgia. But what he did was he said, okay, all the people that this was a decade ago when they were in their living the high life in high school, now they're out there in the real world and they're reminiscing. So he hit it hard, and that's why this movie made so much money, because of the people who missed those times. So I think if we were born around the same time as Lucas, we would think that this movie was even greater than they did back then, just because we missed that period of our life. Just like when we look back in the 90s, for some reason, KJ, I still look back in the 80s, as you can tell by most of my movie selections. That's why I think we're missing a little something there of why this was so successful in that time period.
But you don't have a little affection or recognition of like being 17, 18, senior year of high school and like not having anything to do. So you drive around and go to the diner, or we're all from New Jersey, so we go to diners in New Jersey. That's what you do. But that kind of aimlessness, that's what I liked most about the movie. And that I actually felt nostalgic for that, for being 18 years old and not having a location, but only having a Dodge Dynasty, which was my first car. It's a boat of a car.
Manual blinkers.
Yep, manual blinkers.
Not by design.
It's time for question 2.
While cruising the town, Kurt has a chance encounter at a stoplight with a driver he refers to as the most dazzling creature he's ever seen. His words, not mine. What was the vehicle this vision, this goddess drove?
Locked in.
Locked in, although I don't think I have that much detail.
Locked in, but I don't even know if I'm gonna. Yeah, locked in.
I'm gonna go with Tom to give KJ a chance to gather his thoughts.
It's a white Ford Thunderbird.
Doug?
I was just gonna say white Thunderbird.
I was just gonna say Ford.
Okay, KJ will get 0.5. And Tom and Doug will get the full point. It was now this they did not specify in the movie, but it was a 1956 Ford Thunderbird. I would have also accepted T-Bird. And the reason I brought this up is this is one of the vignettes that we are introduced to through one of the main characters, Kurt's travels in this film. Before I go into that, I did want to just share that I didn't know this. The blonde in the T-Bird was actually Suzanne Summers of TV's Three's Company, and also she's a big beauty and health entrepreneur. So I just thought that was an interesting little tidbit before she was in that show. That's one of her roles. But really, I wanted to focus on, and I think Tom started this conversation in the last question, these different stories, these different vignettes that follow the main characters. What did you all think about that way as a storytelling method?
The movie to me felt like a soundtrack that happened to have a movie with it. And I thought it worked great. I mean, every time the next song came on, I was dancing in my chair to it or bopping along with it. And I think you see echoes of this movie too, like Dazed and Confused. There's got to be one for the 90s by this point. I don't know. But I really like the idea of taking the soundtrack of an era, putting some kind of film to it, and making us all smile and, oh, remember when? Like, I'm a sucker for these kind of movies. So I thought the vignettes, they worked, right? They're not overly memorable. They're just something to have on while you're listening to the fun music.
I also thought of Dazed and Confused, so it's funny that you should mention that.
Yeah, when Lucas was telling Ron Howard about it when he was auditioning, he described it as a musical, to which Ron Howard said, I can't sing. And he said, well, that's not really a problem, which confused Ron Howard. But apparently that was Lucas's innovation here, was this idea of having music constantly playing throughout the movie to indicate what kind of mood he was in when he was writing the scene.
Yeah, so I think it works. This genre of film, it's not necessarily my favorite. I think I would put it in the category of I enjoy watching it, once and probably don't need to watch it again. But I think this probably set the template for a lot of these other movies going forward. I don't know if was any before this, at least that I know of, that kind of set that stage.
It actually opened up the doors for all this like 50s, 60s nostalgia, because Happy Days and Grease and all that stuff came after this film. So it did open the door up for that, to look back at that genre. I'm in the same camp as Doug, where I've seen it. I can talk about it in this episode. I think I'm good. I didn't buy into the nostalgia of that time. And I think that, as I was saying before, is just because I'm not a creature from those times. I'm not from then. So I don't have that strong, correlation that people who grew up anywhere within that, plus or minus a decade might at least understand it better.
I had no problem identifying with the characters, and actually, this sense, as I said before, the sense of nostalgia for me was aimless youth, right? That's something that kind of exists year to, all the time. Being young is kind of in part being aimless because you're not burdened with responsibility. You're not burdened with an aim, with a target rather. The kind of vignette thing reminds me a little bit of Altman films. If anybody's seen Robert Altman movies, he uses that a lot. Like Nashville is a film that comes out around this time that we are doing probably on this podcast because it's one of my favorites. So sorry in advance. And so that kind of that actually, the vignette part of it I liked a lot. What I had trouble with was actually the way character development was sort of staged. It was sort of kind of lame. I kind of wasn't convinced by it.
Yeah, I thought there were a bunch of events that were just stuck in there to move the plot along. Things that they felt maybe a little bit forced, but it was like, for example, the girl going in the car with John Milner. It just was very abrupt, but that was a very necessary point for their whole, journey throughout the movie.
So when watching this movie and then reflecting on this movie, the challenges I had were, I did enjoy it. I'm not saying it's a bad movie, so I don't want that to be misconstrued. But in some of the research I was doing, I even saw all the critically acclaim and the accolades of this movie. And I saw something where it said in 1995, the U.S. Library of Congress deemed it, culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant and selected it for preservation in the National Film Registry. I just wasn't compelled to this movie to this great level that it seems society at that time and generations later did. So that was one of the challenges. I enjoyed it, but I feel like I was supposed to be blown away by it, and I wasn't.
Do you think if George Lucas didn't do Star Wars, would American Graffiti still be in the zeitgeist?
It was a hit on its own, and it probably allowed him the flexibility to create Star Wars.
But I mean, today, do you think it would have stood the test of time? Right? We're talking about it now. If Star Wars never happened, would we have reached back to American Graffiti to talk about it?
I think so. I mean, it was a critical success. It's still critically revered. I don't think young dudes would be watching it because young dudes follow are more likely to follow fantasy and sci-fi than they are I don't know, like coming of age period pieces. But I still think that even now, despite our skepticism of the movie, skepticism is the wrong word, but our lack of love for the movie, it's still highly critically respected. I mean, how many Oscar movies do people still love? Oscar nominated films from like the 70s do people still love and respect, even though there's not like the kind of cult following you see with Lucas product?
Yeah, I definitely see it from that perspective. And to answer KJ's question straight on, from my perspective of the whole premise of this movie, of this episode, would I have picked this film? The answer is no, because I picked this because I'm a Star Wars fan and I wanted to explore some more of Lucas's earlier works. However, I do think, and Tom was saying this as well, an older generation would still have been interested in reviewing this movie and actually sharing this movie probably with their next generation.
It's not a bad movie.
No, I agree. And I think Nick, you hit the nail on the head, right?
Yeah.
where we brought this to the table because you watched Star Wars and said, "Hey, let's finish the George Lucas collection of what he's directed." So yeah, I think that's the answer right there.
And to Tom's point, it's not a bad movie. It's just I think this was a nostalgia draw, and I'm just not drawn into that nostalgia. It's still a fun movie, not my favorite, but it's still a well-made movie.
And it's well directed. I mean, it's probably better directed than Episode 4, A New Hope. I would say. I think because he's so constrained, he's forced to come up with things. Like the way people have conversations between cars, right? I think those scenes kind of have more life in them than a lot of the acting scenes in Star Wars. What's such a draw in Star Wars is the world building. His world building is so strong. But I think just in terms of style, this movie is far more stylish.
Was this your first watch, Tom?
Yes.
So I've seen this movie. This might be my fourth or fifth. I really enjoy it. I mean, you guys are saying, but I really do. I'll usually turn it on if I'm working on a project on the computer. Like it's a good movie to have on in the background. And I wonder if you watch it again, if some of that dialogue doesn't start to sound as stiff as some of the love scenes in episode 2. Like you start like, wait, that's really Richard Dreyfuss? Because I've seen Richard Dreyfuss do things, and that it looks like, a performance that's being told to nope, stiffer, calm down. You're doing so. I don't know.
Really, you didn't like Richard Dreyfuss in it? He was my favorite part.
No, he was good, but I don't know if he was as good as he is in future films. But I mean, maybe that's an actor grows, right?
Yeah, he's 26 in this. Yeah,
there's even sometimes where he's mugging for the camera, where he's kind of looking like we're doing this now. But
I love that stuff. It was so I liked his sense of irony. He played this character with that kind of sense.
So far, Tom and Doug are tied at 2 points each, and KJ has half a point. We'll be right back after this quick commercial break.
This episode is proudly presented by Title Judge from Obnoxious Synopsis Limited. Does your brain hurt when trying to determine what a movie may be about solely by its name? I sure know mine does. Join the millions like me who already use Title Judge. Never waste firing synapses on a synopsis again. Here's an example of what likely happens in American Graffiti.
This is the story of a young man, like many others out there, who strive for one thing: to design the greatest graffiti tag in history, or at least in America. He practices day and night over carefully selected musical montages to be the best. Just when he's at the culmination of mastering his art, the graffiti market is inundated with mass-produced Asian graffiti imports, degrading the demand for top-shelf American-made graffiti. Undeterred by the artistic onslaught, he petitions the government to ban foreign graffiti. Just when it doesn't look like the measurable pass, the holdouts have a change of heart, and it's made a law. Long live American Graffiti.
Title Judge. Remember, you can always judge a movie by its title.
And we're back. Before we get into the 2 remaining questions, Doug, we have a critical question we ask all our guests. In this season, the question is, if you could watch this movie with anyone, dead or alive, who would it be?
I guess Harrison Ford, just because of the people in this movie. I think he would be the most interesting person.
I wonder if he'd have anything positive to say, right? He's kind of grouchy anyway. And then he's going to look back at this where do you think he had a big role, right? He's going to be like, oh yeah, this movie.
Well, what I do think he would tell you is that he wasn't going to take the role because originally they wanted him to have a flat top. And he said, the only way I'm going to take this role is if I don't have to cut my hair, because he was already getting a little disillusioned with acting. He was doing some carpentry at the time. And that's where the Stetson cowboy hat came in. So he'd probably tell you that.
Apparently he got the role because he did carpentry work for the casting director.
There you go. I didn't know.
It's time for question 3.
Terry the Toad Fields is a man of many names. Well, at least 2. What is his machismo alter ego?
Locked in.
Locked in.
I don't remember a name. I'll lock in and description.
Okay. Tom, start us off.
He describes himself as a hunter who trains ponies, has a Jeep with four-wheel drive and a gun rack, which he uses to shoot things. When he's called out for shooting poor little animals, he says, well, when you're shooting a bear, I figure it's either me or him. So, his machismo is that, and then he had to sell the ponies to buy his car. So that's his machismo personality. I don't remember if there's a name associated with it.
That's a pretty long name you got there, Tom. Doug, how about you?
It would be Terry the Tiger.
KJ?
Yep, Terry the Tiger.
I would have accepted Terry the Tiger or just Tiger. The lady, the blonde, does refer to him as both. Tom, everything you said is true, but it does not answer the question. So the points will be going to KJ and Doug. We started talking about this a little bit within the vignettes, but I was interested in exploring more of the character interactions. The reason I started with this question was I actually thought this whole sequence, I bought into it after a while. At first, I was like, this is kind of ridiculous, but I did actually find it as pretty decent comic relief. What did you think of all of the different character interactions? Did any of them jump out at you specifically?
I had to say Richard Dreyfuss was my favorite part of this. One of my favorite interactions is when they're not called the Pythons, they're called the Pharaohs. The gang, the Pharaohs, they're going to wrap a cord around the back axle of a police car, so that when the police car tries to pull away, it rips the back axle out. And the head of the Pharaohs kind of like sneaks across the street, and Richard Dreyfuss just casually walks behind him, completely upright. It's this kind of really fun little ironic shield his character is able to put up. The other thing I loved was Debbie, right? That was the girl who's going along with the tiger, as he's known. I love how she is obsessed. What we learn is we think she's kind of a ditzy blonde, and she sort of is, but she's also obsessed with a serial killer who puts goat heads next to the body. And so there's this little scene. It's lovely scene where they're walking back after his car's been stolen, and she's just talking about this serial killer who like puts goats near his body and removes body parts and rearranges them. And she's completely oblivious to the effect she's having on him. I think those are my two little favorite character moments.
She also wants to get her a better view if it is happening around them. And then with the Pharaohs, did you guys think that guy was like in his 30s? Like he did not look like a high school or whatever,
I thought that was David Hasselhoff at first, traveling back in time.
Oh, this movie was big in Germany too.
You know what else I liked about the characters? All the main characters were friends. Like, everybody was friends with the Toad. They were all friends, and I think that helped the nostalgia of what Tom was talking about, hanging out in high school, driving around. You're kind of friends with everybody, even if you've had scuffles or whatever, because you're just out aimless. There's no reason not to be friends unless you're the Pharaohs and you want to take over this or you want to start a fight or whatever. But I really liked how they looked like they all enjoyed hanging out with each other.
Talking about the different interactions, Steve, played by Ron Howard, and thinking back to high school days, he's sitting there trying to convince his girlfriend that we're so strong that I think we should see other people because it'll show us like just that's such like a high school dialogue to have to justify it. It was ridiculous, but also I enjoyed it at the same time that he was even giving it a go.
The other, I guess, main character pairing that I enjoyed was John Milner, and Carol, the little girl that ends up in his car, which I thought that led to some of the funniest dialogue, even though it could have been a very inappropriate pairing, and some of the stuff they said I think would not be approved for movies today. But I thought it was funny, and I don't think it was. I think it was set up in a way that was not creepy, like it could have been.
Yeah, that is sweet, and he's a lot of fun to watch. John Milner, played by Paul Le Mat, who I think at this time he hadn't acted very much. He was a boxer, and but I agree. I think that was th- those sequences were a lot of fun. They had really great chemistry. I think of all the male female pairings, they probably had the best chemistry. And that's oh God, what's her name? Mackenzie Phillips, is that right? She's the daughter of the Papas from the Mama and the Papas. Um,
That is true. And also, Paul Le Mat, this was his first feature film. He did a TV movie before that, but this was his first feature film.
When he first comes on the screen, I think he's supposed to be kind of like James Dean, right? He's supposed to be this cool guy, but he ends up being a guy acting like James Dean, which I thought worked better than if he actually could have pulled off a James Dean. He's a guy that's been in town too long, and he was nostalgic for something that happened a little earlier than what we see in the movie, as he says with the surfing rock isn't for him, and right, he is a guy that's 3 years older than everybody graduating high school. So yeah, he was great. I did enjoy that.
The other thing about that is he's almost like the old-timey tough guy. Now the tough guy is like ripped muscles. This guy just has a white t-shirt and slick hair.
yeah, he's the guy who's not going anywhere.
Yeah.
That's his whole thing. Everybody else, I mean, the Toad is still in high school, but really, he's a comic relief character, right? He's bottom in this story more than anything. The other characters, their stories are about leaving, about getting out, and I think one of the problems I have with this movie is it it treats getting out and staying as equally valid actions, um, without any kind of with a bizarre feeling towards which one it prefers. I found that a little confusing. But regardless, he's the guy who's going to stay behind and whose time is coming due, which is how that chase scene goes, right? In the chase scene, he was going to lose, except Harrison Ford's Bob accidentally crashes the car. So his time is up. That's what we're watching. A character whose time is up.
Before I go on to the next question, I have to bring up during that crash that everyone got out of a pretty devastating crash with barely a scratch. I know Harrison Ford was grabbing his arm a little bit. He puts pressure on it, so I don't think it was fully dislocated or anything. So that was an amazing feat that they all were barely dazed by that incident.
That's what cars were like back then. They were like steel traps.
Well, that's the thing. The car survived. The people didn't. That's the thing back then, usually. So I'm going to move on to the last question. We have a very close match here. Doug is in the lead with 3. KJ has a whopping 1.5, and Tom has 2 full points.
It's time for question 4.
At the end of the film, there's a title card sharing the fate of some of the main characters. How many were included?
Locked in.
Locked in.
Locked in.
KJ, how many?
There were 4 characters included.
4.
I'm also going to say 4.
Well, you are all correct. Doug was flawless on this episode and will take it down. But what I wanted to do is explore more of this. I know we've talked a bit about the characters. And one of the things that I thought was interesting, some of George Lucas's motivations, 3 of the 4 characters were actually representing Lucas at different stages of his life. He said Kurt was his personality in the college years at USC. John was the teenage street racing and junior college years. And Toad was his nerdy years, like when he was a freshman in high school and had trouble getting dates. It's very interesting to me how he based most of those characters on his own personalities. The other thing I wanted to bring up in this is there were some controversies with this film, specifically this end title card. It only portrayed the male main characters. And Tom, I think, brought this up earlier on too, about how some of the females ended up being more of plot devices. The writers who wrote the second draft with George Lucas, Willard Huck and Gloria Katz, they found the ending very depressing, and they really did not like that Lucas only showed the male characters at the end. His excuse was it would create another title card and didn't want that. But let's talk a little bit not only about any kind of controversies that happened in the movie, but this actual ending of this film.
So I guess if they represented George Lucas at different points in his life, he might have also said, "Hey, I could have ended up in Nam. Hey, I could have ended up stuck here like John was, but I happened to be the Kurt that got out and then did something artistic." So I that's another. I didn't realize that those were Lucas's.
I think it's interesting that Steve is the one that's left out because he seemed like more of the everyman that I think more people would relate to.
But he never left. He stayed put.
Yeah, he becomes an insurance salesman, right? That's the thing, which I guess is a fate equivalent to death in Vietnam by the standards of the title card.
Well, he was from Modesto too, and he's the only one who stayed the townie and didn't get out there and explore the world.
Yeah, you get the impression that that's what's going on. That it seems to be with these title cards, like you were saying, KJ, it's sort of a critique or a sort of a recognition that this is lost innocence. Which I find a little confusing because it seems to be a movie about coming of age, right? And we've talked about coming of age movies a lot on this podcast for some reason, even though we rarely do them. But in a coming of age movie, a person becomes an adult, right? And they might not technically be an adult, but they get to that place of maturity. And that's what this is about. And different people coming of age in different ways. You have to leave. You have to leave and have an adventure. That's what Wolfman tells Kurt. Home is I already have a home. I already have friends. I don't need to reinvent that. That's what Steve discovers. And fair enough. But in the end, it's like it's framing coming of age as kind of like the destruction of a world, which I guess in some way is true. I mean, time passes and culture changes, and the 70s are different from the 50s and whatnot. But the downer note is really bizarre. It's like, what are we supposed to get out of that? That we were supposed to remain children forever? I mean, after all, like, are we supposed to think like John Milner had it going on? He was doing the right thing by kind of trying to make a claim to his high school days, even though he's 22. I mean, I found it kind of incoherent.
Even his ending was accidental. He was killed by a drunk driver.
Which does what for us?
Nothing.
Like what are we supposed to get from that? Like,
no, I don't know.
Whatever you do, you're screwed unless you become an artist and hide in Canada to avoid the draft, which is why I imagine Kurt is in Canada, right? That's probably the reason.
You could always become an insurance agent. Yeah.
But that's also a dead end, right? And that's supposed to. That's how I read that. When you find out that, Ron Howard's character becomes an insurance agent and never leaves Modesto, that's not good. That's a kind of a failure to launch, which cancels out a lot of this. Like, well, if I already have friends in a home, why should I go find it elsewhere? That devalues that conclusion. So, it seems like Lucas wants to give his characters these varieties of ways of coming of age, while at the same time critiquing the sort of end of innocence in a historic sense, the end of innocence that starts with Kennedy being killed, Robert Kennedy being killed, Vietnam, the student revolution of 68, all these things. But he's kind of conflating the coming of age of human beings who we're supposed to care about to the end of innocence of an era, of a way this country was.
The ending was my biggest challenge with this film, just across the board.
I think it might have been better without the closing title card. Just to, just like you can imagine what might happen to these characters on your own. I guess it's this thing I have with these ending cards on other movies too. Most of the time, I mean, I can't even think of any good ones where I enjoyed it. Maybe comedies where they put something funny in there that happens to the character, but
Anchorman, yeah.
Now they do it as cliche. Like, it's a joke. Whereas then it was not a joke.
But it's doing something different from the normal title card, which just reassures you, right? Normally, you get the title card that everything kind of worked out okay. Here, it's providing an ironic reframing of the film we've just seen. It's not about coming of age; it's about loss of innocence, and these things are very different in how they're framed.
Do we think Lucas knew somebody who went to Nam? Right, obviously, yeah. Huh? Do we think Lucas knew somebody who stayed in Modesto and became a sailor?
Yeah.
So these also could just be, here's how boring life is, and here's what happens. Right? He showed you a slice of life that was probably more exciting than any given night in Modesto, but it's kind of the summation of all of his memories in one night. Sure, that's cool. And then he might have looked around and been like, "Wee, I got to go and make these movies and do this fun stuff, but most people end up, doing something kind of normal, quote unquote, or have tragic deaths. That's I don't know.
One of the two.
It's time for Movie Rant.
So there was still one other potential question I had in case we needed a bonus question to break a tiebreaker. And I thought it might be fun just to say it anyway. The question is, why did Terry the Tiger sell his hunting horses?
Oh, I think I said
Yeah,
that,
I think it's
right?
been answered.
Yeah.
Yes, it was. To a great degree, and that's why I was glad we didn't have a tie. And yes, Tom, you said it perfectly. He had to buy a car, a Jeep pickup with a 4-wheel drive, and a gun rack that he uses primarily for hunting.
For gun rack, it's where I keep my guns for the hunting.
And if it came down to a tiebreaker, it would have been whoever got the most detailed answer to cover all. But I have to say, Tom, you hit all the points.
Okay. What a glorious second place I'm in. Yeah, so thing about movie, something I wanted to bring up, because I was reading about this film, and something that's interesting is the way these young people respond to authority and how authority is framed. And what I thought was interesting was people in authority are not a big part of this movie. They come in at certain points, but they're not really that vital. And I was wondering, usually in coming of age, there's kind of a tangle with authority, right? That you have to deal with authority figures, or if especially if it's like a fun last night type movie, there's always the principal or whatever who sucks, and they want to get a little revenge, or they want to get away from him.
Rooney.
Yeah, but that's not really a focus on this movie, and I was wondering what you guys thought of that absence.
I don't think there's a song that would have worked that Lucas could have put an authority figure to. So I'm still convinced that, headcanon, this is a soundtrack. None of the songs of that era led themselves to the town sheriff or somebody fitting into a vignette with, what would even be playing in the background there? That I think that's what it would come down to.
That's actually not a bad point at all. No, seriously, like I know
This is
you're
the 35th episode, and I've had one good point, so please mark this down.
Well, I didn't mean it that condescendingly. I realize that. It's just you described it as a headcanon, and it isn't a headcanon.
Oh no! All right.
No, I don't think so. I don't think it's like you're not inventing a plot that is going on in the background that we all have to assume happens for your point to make sense.
A prequel. There is a sequel.
Yeah, I have been misusing the word headcanon often.
I think this.
Yeah, but it's a musical, and everything has to kind of be choreographed. It's sort of improv over musical scenes. So yeah, that may be a good point. It just doesn't go with the mood of the songs to have that kind of tension.
I can only recall 2 incidents with law enforcement. One is when John Milner gets pulled over and the cop says he wants to catch him in the act. So he gives him like a minor ticket. And the funny scene that you guys discussed earlier where they ripped the back axle off of the cop car. Were there any others? Those are the only 2 I can recall.
The principal, he tells the principal to to
Oh,
eat
right.
a duck, I think.
Yeah, something very menacing.
Yeah.
Go kiss a duck, Marblehead.
So authority figure, not law enforcement, but authority figure.
Yeah. But it's that I thought was a strange absence. But I really like your point, KJ. It's just we're grooving, right?
Yeah.
That's what
We're
the 50s is. We're
cruising
grooving. Yeah.
around. Yep.
Mhm.
Hmm.
I think it also felt a little weird because, at least for me, like when the officer pulled Milner over, I felt like it was foreshadowing that he was going to catch him, in the movie. And then also, when they ripped the axle off the police car, that's, fairly serious. And there's no consequence after that. And Kurt, he said something about stand for justice or something like that. And, he's like, he's not hiding his face or anything. He's, he's leaning out of the car. So if they knew who he was, they knew he would be behind it, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of sneaking around and stuff.
Well, and everybody knows he stole from that arcade or whatever with the pinball machines too, right? That he got away with that
KJ,
because he
he's
got on a
leaving-
that was
plane.
another
Like,
weird thing.
He's leaving town. It doesn't matter. You can do whatever
oh,
you
those
want.
kids
This
stealing.
this was the 60s, They didn't have the internet.
Yeah. Where did all the money in the pinball machines go? I don't know. It mustn't have been when Kurt was here. He's cool.
He got a scholarship. I couldn't end this episode without bringing up one of the thoughts that I had during this movie. And I wrote it down in my notes here. Cruising equals Tinder. People are just driving down the street, talking through car doors very slowly and jumping in and out of vehicles. Like nowadays, that just seems so unsafe. Think about it. Harrison Ford's character comes up and a girl just says, pull over, I'll get in your car. Like at that time, that might have just been a way of life. But what do you guys think? Doesn't that seem extremely foreign?
Yes and no. I mean, there wasn't like where we grew up. We in high school when we started driving, right? We didn't have cell phones. But I mean, I remember kind of driving around trying to find people.
No, we drove around trying to find people. We didn't pick people up on the road and have strangers just jump in our cars. That's the part that I'm talking. And when I was watching it with my wife, we were almost making a joke like it was like Tinder.
Oh.
If they liked him, pull over to the right. If we didn't like him, we keep driving. Like that's the part that I was saying, not the finding people stuff.
The actual culture.
The cruising culture, the transaction, if you will, of picking up a date to drive in your car with. That was just
I apparently that is a thing that happened.
Oh, I know. It just seems so foreign, and that's not too long ago.
Yeah. I kind of like I like the I guess what you would call world building, even though it's not sci-fi, that or world capturing of that. I understood that culture a little bit, right? The youth culture and the cruising culture, and that that is kind of itself sitting on a precipice, because once the hippies come, that goes away, right? That's not how you meet women anymore. And so I did like that. It's also car porn, right? A lot of this movie is about looking at beautiful vehicles, move around. They're as important as the people. I think that type of thing is is also a lot of fun. Watching how the car itself is a form of flirtation. Putting forward a fast car or a nice car is the means of peacocking at this time. And so you go up and down, they're like birds, right? Moving up and down this block, trying to get laid, showing their wonderful chrome. I remember, when the Toad is in the, what's the car he is in? I don't remember, but he's in a beautiful car, and they're like, oh man, how is a person like you in this nice vehicle? Like you just see how incongruous it is. And the white Mustang, the white.
I think it was a
Thunderbird.
Chevy Impala. I think it was a Chevy Impala.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, but and also the Thunderbird, right? The most beautiful woman in the world is in the most beautiful car on the street. There's an equivalence here, that and the Toad plotline is about the kind of both the disruption of that equivalence, but also its affirmation, because Toad, when he steps into a higher class vehicle than his kind of social status implies, he gets kind of rammed down, even though he does get the girl in the end.
You are absolutely right. Well, Doug, I'd like to congratulate you once again for winning this week's episode. It was so great having you back on Talking Pictures Trivia.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
All right. Hopefully we can get you back for another episode this season. Check out our website, talkingpicturestrivia.com, for more information about us and our episodes. You can find us wherever you listen to podcasts, as well as our YouTube channel. We are extremely grateful for any positive reviews, as those help others like you find us. If you like what you hear, remember to like and subscribe to our show. Do you think American Graffiti is worthy of its critical acclaim? Leave a comment on our YouTube channel and let's continue the conversation. Join us next week when we discuss a movie that's been on KG's list for a while, from 1984, Footloose. Should be an interesting one to talk about. See you then.
Ding, 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 ding.